Knowing that the heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all things, I want you to just listen very closely. On the pretext that the Chinese had kidnapped a Japanese soldier, a momentous conflict between two brother nations was sparked in 1937. Now, just keep in mind, God knew all of this when He made Adam in the garden. Keep in mind, God knew all of this when Jeremiah said, "Great is thy faithfulness."
Amen.
China and Japan shared much by way of culture and history, yet when hostilities broke out in 1937, each country fought the other with a tenacity and barbarity scarcely witnessed on a battlefield. The missing soldier at the heart of the dispute turned up some hours later, by the way, and was thought to have been biding his time in a brothel. Lust, when it is conceived, bringeth forth sin. In the ensuing violence, one of the worst atrocities ever committed by uniformed soldiers took place in an incident over which tensions still run high even today. The scene of the horror was Nanking, a Chinese city serving as a makeshift capital following the fall of Beijing, whose population of some 200,000 was swollen with refugees trying to escape the onslaught of the Japanese army. It was 5 months after the first shots of the war were fired that the Japanese army came within sight of Nanking. The government, led by Generalissimo Jashai, evacuated, leaving a determined Chinese army to fend off the invaders. The first bombardment of the city walls came on 9 December 1937 after Chinese military leaders ignored a call for surrender. Within 4 days, the Japanese, with their superior mechanized weapons, had blasted their way into the city. An estimated 40,000 Chinese had perished in the battle, yet that was only the start of the population's suffering. First, there was turmoil as the desperate Chinese tried to flee through a rear city wall. Inside the 70-foot tunnel which led to the gate, 2 vehicles had collided and burst into flames. There was chaos as a surge of Chinese people turned to run from the flames and faced a tide of incoming city residents who were themselves followed by machine gun-toting Japanese soldiers. Countless scores died in the melee and suffocated, trampled underfoot, or fatality wounded by Japanese bullets. Doubtless Nanking's refusal to surrender was an irritant to the Japanese, yet nothing could explain the appalling acts which took place after the fall of the city. Before I read on, let me say, great is thy faithfulness.
Amen.
In the words of one Swedish observer, with a blindness and absence of psychological judgment that astonishes the Westerner who is at all familiar with Chinese mentality, the Japanese soldiers sullied their march to victory with repeated acts of cruelty, ruthlessness, and bloodshed on innocent people. These were actions unparalleled in modern times and perpetrated by no civilized nation. During their approach to the city gates, 2 Japanese officers had a competition to see who could kill the most Chinese. It was a race to reach 100, but when confusion reigned over the body count, they amicably decided to make their final target 150. Later it was reported Mukai's blade was slightly damaged in the competition. That was one of the officers. He explained that this was the result of cutting a Chinese in half, helmet and all. The contest was fun, he declared. The heart is deceitful, desperately wicked. Any Chinese who turned and ran from the Japanese was doomed to die. While observing the rights of the international community, the Japanese then embarked on their debauched and disgusting campaign against the locals. Where they could, the European doctors, welfare workers, and writers sheltered the Chinese and pleaded for tolerance on their behalf. Without this moderating presence, even more would have died. Now listen, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. but great is thy faithfulness.
Amen. Yeah.
For 7 weeks, the women and girls of Nanking were subject to repeated rape by the rampaging Japanese soldiers, often many times in a single night. The soldiers knew no bounds and picked on pregnant women, the elderly, and children as young as 10. Degrading sexual assaults were also carried out in broad daylight by ordinary soldiers and officers alike. Although women were the main victims, there were also cases of attacks on young boys. Anyone who tried to intervene was stabbed or shot. And let me say what this report doesn't account, friend, is the fact that after those women were repeatedly raped, then they were killed. Anyone who tried to intervene was stabbed or shot. There were frequent cases of civilians being used for bayonet practice. Others were disemboweled for sport. There were many massacres in which the victims first had to dig their own grave. They were then lined up at the edge of the pit and shot or bayoneted or both. But great is thy faithfulness.
Amen.
It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed. At least 2,000 Chinese were buried alive in Nanking. Several were roasted over a fire and still more killed in a bath of industrial acid. There were cases of soldiers being tied up and then blown up by hand grenades. Ferocious dogs were also used to kill Chinese prisoners, and wild stories circulated about Japanese soldiers sating themselves on the hearts and livers of dead Chinese. Official estimates for the number of dead vary between 155,000 and 300,000. The orgy of raping and killing lasted for 7 long weeks. In charge of the men was General Matsui, who was himself apparently devastated at the conduct of his men. Matsui, who once admitted that the Japanese army is probably the most undisciplined in the world today, reserved a tirade of abuse for the officers under his command who had permitted their troops to run riot. In common with other Japanese generals, he considered the rank and file men to be uneducated, illiterate, and akin to barbarians. After the scandal of Nanking, General Matsui was recalled to Tokyo. Soon afterwards, he retired and devoted himself to building a temple in which to atone for the misdeeds of the army in Nanking. He could not atone for what had happened.
Yeah.
Nope. But great is thy faithfulness. Amen. Stay with me, we're going somewhere. 2 missionaries from Nanking had a very different view of the dilemma. The common soldiers are all right if they're not drunk. The Japanese in general are very easily intoxicated, however, and then the trouble begins. Japanese people have since tried to excuse the actions of the army in those dark days. There were cases of Chinese mutilations of Japanese soldiers both before and after death in the war, but none to match the terrorism which took place in Nanking. For years, the explanation for Japan's actions was that it was liberating its neighbors from Western influence. The explanation has been accompanied by a marked reluctance to apologize or reparate for the events which took place in the name of the emperor. Even as late as 1994, a Japanese government minister, Mr. Shigito Nagano, denied the war against China had begun through his country's aggression and denied the rape of Nanking had even taken place. In a newspaper interview, he said, "It's a mistake to call the Pacific War a war of aggression. It's not true that it was carried out with invasion as an objective. We sincerely believed in liberating the colonies." That's a lie. Although he retracted his remarks and resigned, there's little doubt his opinion reflects a body of thought still widely believed in Japan today. Naturally, such blunders inspire fury and resentment in those neighboring countries which suffered under dominance of the rising sun. Abuse of Chinese prisoners particularly occurred all over the country, not just in Nanking. Before the end of the Sino-Japanese War in 1945, at least 2.5 million soldiers on both sides had died, and there were many million more civilian deaths, particularly in China. Whether the Japanese warmongers sincerely believed they were freeing Asia from its colonial ties or not, their commitment to war with China was ultimately a disastrous one. It kept an enormous number of troops tied up for years as they tried to conquer a land that proved to be unconquerable. Great is thy faithfulness. God is not Allah, God is love.
Amen.
And God makes no mistakes.
Amen.
And God knows all. Amen. I mentioned again on Wednesday night about Jacob DeShazer, and we're not going to go through all of that this morning. You all, I know some were not here a few years ago when I did that message on Wednesday night on Above and Beyond the Call of Duty. But Jacob DeShazer was the bombardier on B-25 number 16, which would have been the first one placed on the USS Hornet, which made it the last one in the row. And I told you on Wednesday night that it was after they got on board that he met his pilot, and the pilot of that, and the name of the plane was the Bat Out of Hell, but the pilot's name was Bill Farrell. Bill Farrell was a Christian. He wasn't only a Christian, but he was a faithful Christian. And he was a member of the First Baptist Church in Darlington. Jacob DeShazer, if you remember, and I mentioned this again the other night, his father was a minister back in Oregon, but Jacob had never been saved. He had been raised, he'd been taught, but he was still lost as a young man. Happened to be the oldest in the 5-member crew. But to make a long story short, listen, God intervening in the lives of individuals. God knows how to put people together in the right place at the right time, though the circumstances may not seem right to you and I. God knows exactly what He's doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not going, the details you can go back or you can read it later, but listen, their target in that particular plane was to drop 500-pound incinerated bombs on the Mitsubishi aircraft plant that made the Zeros. And they dropped those 5 incendiary bombs, and after dropping those bombs, they headed south down the peninsula of Japan. And listen, they had you know the story. They had to launch hours early because they had been detected by the Japanese, and so they bombed in the daylight, but they were going to have to try to find their landing place at night. And you know all of that. But what I'm getting at, here's what I want you to understand. Great is thy faithfulness. Jacob is not a saved man, but Bill is. And there's going to be a lot of atrocities take place. And listen, Bill is going to feel like in his life before his death, just like Jeremiah did here, he's going to lament the condition that he's in. But it's going to be that pilot, Bill Farrell, that God is really going to use in his faithfulness to God to be instrumental in Jacob's life while they're in a Japanese prison. Now, things have not changed since 1937. The heart is desperately wicked, and it's deceitful above all things. They ran out of fuel flying in the middle of the night in a horrific storm, and they had no recourse but to bail out. Those 5 men had to bail out of that B-25 Mitchell bomber. And Jacob was one of the first, and the pilot Bill was one of the last. They had no idea, Brother Mike, but they were bailing out. They were bailing out over China like they were supposed to, but they were bailing out over a part of China that was occupied by the Japanese. And it's amazing. When they bailed out freeing, none of these men had ever parachuted. They taught them how to shoot guns. They taught them how to fly planes and take off and to land. They never taught any of them how to jump out of a plane. And so all 5 of them had to jump out in the middle of the night.